Hi there, and welcome to this week's installment of the Good News according to Job. And this week we are turning to Job 29 to 31. It's quite a lengthy piece, so I won't be reading it for us today. But if you've been taking this journey with us, this is quite a significant point for us, particularly in the book of Job, as the whole book is surrounding this discourses that take place between Job and his friends, and then Job and God. What makes this passage quite significant is, perhaps in your Bible, you've got the heading, Job's Final Defense. That's obviously something that we've put in there, but it's a helpful, just a helpful header for this section, as what is significant about it is this is the last time Job is going to have this much to say. From here on, Job doesn't really have that much left to say. There's here and there a few comments or things that he says, but out of everything that we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks, this is really the last time that we're going to hear Job in this way, in this intensity, in this thought pattern that he goes through. And in some ways, this is his final defense, if you want to put it that way. But it is also, it builds his argument one last time. It's perhaps him defending himself, perhaps against the friends, but it is actually him going through his life in many ways as an individual, as a person, a man who fears God, who shuns evil. And it is interesting as we glance at the section, and I do encourage you to try and take some time to read it for yourself, but as you glance at chapter 29, 30 and 31, you really see Job thinking through all of these things that have actually transpired with the discourses of the three friends. You hear some of their words coming through again. You hear some of the phrases and the ideas, and Job, just yet again, he will emphasize a certain point, and he will say certain things in certain ways to just solidify for us and remind us of what we've already been told in the beginning of Job. So if you've made your way through the weeks with us here looking at Job, maybe you've gotten to a point where you're not sure who Job is anymore. Maybe you're confused. Maybe you're thinking, well, you know what, the friends made some good arguments, and I agree with the friends. There must be something wrong with Job. He must have done something wrong. The author couldn't have known that. God couldn't have said that. Whatever your reasoning is for thinking the way you may be thinking, this passage today should at least solidify for us who Job is. This is who Job is before the next friend comes onto the scene. Elihu comes to speak, and it is the final thing that Job is going to say before God addresses Job himself. And these are important things to just pick up, remind yourself of, if you have lost sight of who Job is, at least according to the book of Job, according to what the author has said, according to what God has said, according to the testing that has been taken place by the will of God, by God permitting it, and what Satan has been doing. It is fascinating to see how Job is thinking at this point. Job has been sitting, we might want to think a couple hours, but this is possibly weeks, if not months. He has been sitting in dust and ash, mourning the loss of his family, his possessions, the people around him, his very own respect within community. And you look at this passage and you wonder just all the extents of where Job's mind is going, what he's thinking about. And he really gives you a glimpse of that in these passages. The section itself, if we had to break it up, there are a number of different sections in Job 29 to 31. And I'm going to just list them just so that you might have a bit of a visual map of what Job 29 to 31 looks like. And there's a lot of stuff happening here. There's a lot of things being said. But just to give you some idea, verse 1 through to 11 of Job 29, you have this idea where Job considers the life that he once had. He considers all the things that were good. He thinks about he thinks just about the days where there was prosperity in his life. And then he considers part of why his life perhaps looked that way to some degree. and he's saying how he wasn't a self-centered man. He didn't live a prideful life, and you really get the idea of of the kind of life that he conducted, the life that he lived in verses 12 through to 17. How he depicts this idea, the very thing that the friends challenge him on, saying that he robbed and he stole and he has what he has because he abused people around him. He took advantage of the weak and the vulnerable. Instead, he's saying, actually, no, it's the opposite of that. My life looked the way it looked because I looked after people. I cared for people. In verse 14, you can catch a glimpse of that word. I put on righteousness as my clothing. And that takes us back again to at least what the author and God tells us about Job. He is upright, he's blameless, fearing God and shunning evil. He really did put on the clothing of righteousness, if you want to put it in that way, as Job does. And then you have this 3 verses, verses 18 to 20. It gives you a glimpse of almost his idea. And I think all of us have this kind of idea of life. We think how we're going to live, where we're going to be in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time. How are we going to end up retiring? Where will we be staying, hoping that we have finances to do all of those things and so on. And he kind of paints that picture. He says, I thought I will die in my own house. My days as numerous as the grains of sand. He had a hopeful picture, and yet he's sitting now in dust and ash. He's lost his family. He's lost everything all around him. And it's almost hard to believe that his dream, his idea of what his life would turn out to be, looks completely the opposite. Now, Job isn't becoming absorbed in himself. He's not becoming absorbed by the idea of what could have been and what isn't now. He's actually taking you through the journey of his life. If you see the progression, he considers how good life was. He considers the life that he conducted. He considered the future of what he pictured, the projection of where his life was headed. And he goes further. He says people used to listen to him. And that you pick up in 21, and that actually carries on all the way through to verse 25 of chapter 29 still. And really the picture that gets painted there, and we're going to just pause for a brief moment just to highlight some things there, is he paints a picture of truly what he actually longed for in his friends. He does so in a way that he says, this is the kind of person that I am, this is the way I conduct things, this is the way I do things in this world. And in many ways it would have been courteous had his friends done the same to him. So listen to these verses, verses 21 to 25. I'll just read it for us. People listened to me expectantly, waiting in silence for my counsel. After I had spoken, they spoke no more. And then listen to this half of this verse. It says, my words fell gently on their ears. They waited for me as for showers and drank in my words as the spring rain. When I smiled at them, they scarcely believed it. The light of my face was precious to them. I chose the way for them and sat as their chief. I dwelt as a king among their troops. I was like one who comforts mourners. And really he paints a picture of, well, this is what a comforter of someone that is mourning, a comforter of mourners should look like. And really there's a bit of a jest, I suppose, toward the friends, saying this is what a comforter, a true comforter should look like, is someone that is able to sit there, that speaks in a way that you can't wait to hear what they have to say. But not only that, when they speak, their words fall gently on your ears. It's not harsh words. It's not an attack, an insult, absolute onslaught of verbal abuse, but it is gentle. And that when you do it, it's refreshing. So he adds to that in verse 21 that his words were like showers. And what he means by that is like the spring rain. As the rain comes, they would drink in his words. The picture of the ground that is thirsty and ready to absorb and drink in the moisture. And so that's the next section, really, verse 21 to 25. He shows how he was a comforter. He was a comforter of man. Job understands what it means to be on the other end, the giving end, where there is a person facing hardship that needs comfort, that needs counseling. And he was good at it. And he's not afraid to admit it because he observes and he sees, he knows this is who he was within society, within his community, and his role has reversed. He has now become despised. And that's where he's taking you in his thinking. So the next section that you actually see is 30. Chapter 30 has two sections to it, really. The one is the mockery that he faces of man, and the second is being facing it under God's will, if we can put it that way. So firstly, you notice in verse 1 it says, "But now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs." And then that runs all the way up. If you keep going on, he says in verse 10, "They detest me and keep their distance. They do not hesitate to spit in my face." And really, that section in chapter 30 highlights the mockery that he faces. He faces this incredible mockery, but not just any mockery from those that are actually social outcasts, or at least societal outcasts within his culture, within his religion, within his sphere of living. These are people that he wouldn't even allow them to essentially sleep with his sheepdogs. He's saying he wouldn't allow them to rest amongst his animals. These are the people that were cast out because they were despicable, wicked people, evil people that were cast out from society. And he says they are the ones, and their young are the ones that are now spitting on me. So it seems like Job is actually quite defensive, quite angry at this point, in the way he at least phrases it and puts it, because he has become a laughingstock to people. He has become a laughingstock to his people originally. And then we see verse 11 changes the focus again slightly. He says, "Now that God has unstrung my bow and afflicted me, they throw off restraint in my presence." And he's saying that actually it is because God has now allowed this. God has permitted it. And he picks that up again when he considers in verse 20. He says, "I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me." And so this is the circumstance under God's headship, under God's control. God has actually disarmed him. The idea of unstringing his bow is an idea that God has disarmed him, made him incapable of actually fighting, defending himself, and because of that, because they see that his defenses are down, they come into attack and throw insults and spit in his face. And these are the things that God has permitted. God has allowed it. And so Job cries out. He cries out from verse 20, and he says, but God doesn't hear him. You turn, in verse 21, you turn on me ruthlessly with the might of your hand. You attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. And it sounds harsh. It sounds terrible language. But Job has an understanding, and he's taking us down a path that we need to explore and understand ourselves. He concludes, to some degree, his thoughts in verse 23. He says, "No, I know you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living." And this is an idea that Job has captured before. He's already highlighted this idea that God is the one that brings down to the grave. God is the one that permits even death. As frightening as it may seem, it is God that gives life, but he also takes away. And this is something that Job has already said right in the beginning of Job in and of itself. And so this is a really incredible picture. And as it goes further, as we carry on in this chapter of chapter 30, it progresses to a point where he is simply saying that he is mourning. He ends in verse 31. He says, "My lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the sound of wailing." He says that he has got he's got no joy at this point. There's no joy in the music, in anything. He's fading and failing. His body is falling apart. And really he has become a creature of the night. Darkness is all around him, and it's an idea that he's painted for us before in previous chapters. Job he is not saying that the darkness, he's not associating the darkness with wickedness. He's simply saying that the weight of this life, the sorrow, the pain, the suffering, the mourning is like darkness over his life, and this is where he sits. But then he says something really interesting as he now considers his current circumstance. And really, this is where his defense comes in. This is where his argument really comes into play, is chapter 31. And if you were wondering who Job is and the kind of life that he conducted, well, he really paints a picture of himself in chapter 31 as he argues his case. Chapter 31, he starts by saying, I made a covenant with my eyes, not to look lustfully at a young woman. Now, that's not the only point that he is making here, but at least we see where his thought pattern is going. He's saying, I've made a covenant with my eyes to make sure that I don't fall prey to sin. So I've put things in place. I've established things with my very own body. I have made a covenant so that I won't fall victim to sin. And ultimately, sin leads to death. And he has done so because he fears it. Listen to what he says as he kind of concludes this thought of his covenant that he has made with himself. In 23, he says, For I dreaded destruction from God, and for fear of his splendor, I could not do such things. That is a concluding thought, not only to the covenant that he's made with his eyes, but to the very life that he has lived. He's saying, if I have done anything, listen to what he says, for example, in verse 5. If I have walked with falsehood, or my foot has hurried after deceit, he says, let God weigh me in honest scales, and he will know that I am blameless. So he's adding to it. He really, in the middle of this, he's saying, well, you know what? If I have done something falsely, if I have walked in falsehood, that's another possibility. He's saying, well, let God weigh me, and he will find that I've been blameless. Again, blameless, picking up on the language that we are told about Job in the beginning, that Job is upright and blameless, and that he fears God and he shuns evil. Notice then, just again, verse 7, it says, if my steps have turned from the path, if my heart has been led by my eyes, or my hands have been defiled. If I have sinned, if I am corrupt in some other way, let God be the judge of me. But also know that I dread the destruction that will come from God. I fear his splendor. I could not do such things. That's a concluding thought as he wrestles through the possibilities of sin that could have entered into his life. He says, I consider it, but I know that I've dealt with it. I've lived a life that is blameless. If there was something, I've dealt with it. But ultimately, let God then be the one that judges, because his scales are far more balanced than human scales. And what he means by that is, I think there's a little bit of a jest once again to the friend, saying, you assume that I have sinned. You assume that I am wicked. You assume that I'm an evil person because of what's happened to me. But I'm saying, when I consider my life, I will rather put the ability to judge it in God's hands, because I know that he is fair. And I know the kind of life I've lived. I've feared God. I've shunned evil. I've been blameless. I've been upright. Job reminds us time and time again. And all for the reason because he dreads the idea of the destruction that will come from God. And he dreads and fears the splendor. He fears God's splendor. And because of that, he says, I couldn't do such a thing. You call me wicked because you're assuming I've done stuff. I'll tell you, I look at my life, I think about it, I look at how I've dealt with my sins in my past, and I can tell you now that there is nothing that I haven't brought before God. And so, if you read this, you really get that weight of who Job is. And again, he brings in these ideas not only of not sinning, but actually living in a good way. And this is, again, bringing into focus something that the friends had already challenged him on. And you pick up there in verse 16 of chapter 31. He says, if I've denied the desires of the poor, or let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I've kept my bread to myself, not sharing it with the fatherless, but from my youth I reared them as a father would, and from my birth I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perishing for lack of clothing, or the needy without garments, and their hearts did not bless me for warming them with the fleece from my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, knowing that I had influence in the court, then let my arm fall from my shoulder. Let it be broken off at the joint. Job, he is reflecting also on this idea of the widow and the orphan. He's painting that picture that the friends have challenged him on, saying, you've taken from them. That's why you're rich. That's why you are powerful. That's why people revered you or respected you, because you gained what you gained by exploiting the weak, exploiting those that can't defend themselves. And here Job is saying, if that is the case, let my arm fall from my body. Let me become incapable of acting, become incapable of doing anything. And beyond that, he says, he paints this picture because he knows this is not the kind of person he is. And again, he's adding to what he already said earlier on. As he painted that picture, how people would come to him for counsel. The weary, the ones in need, and he would be there. His words would be like spring, a spring of water, a rain coming down and watering the ground. And then the next section of chapter 31 carries us basically to the end. And look what he says in verse 24. He says, if I've put my trust in gold, or said to pure gold, you are my security. If I've rejoiced over my great wealth, the fortune my hands had gained. If I have regarded the sun in its radiance, or the moon moving in splendor, so that my heart was secretly enticed, and my hand offered them a kiss of homage, then these also would be sins to be judged, for I would have been unfaithful to God on high. Now he paints a picture here. He's saying, not only have I not been sinning with how I've done things by looking at things that I shouldn't be looking at, or that I've taken advantage of the poor or those that are incapable of looking after themselves. He's saying, beyond that, I haven't idolized anything. I haven't paid homage to the sun. And the picture of that is that I have not put anything else above God. Yeah, to that extent, I have solemnly and solely worshipped God and God alone. And so he is kind of highlighting this picture that he, as he says in verse 28, for I would have been unfaithful to God on high. So he still recognizes that if he put anything above God, if he worshipped anything else, if it was money, if it was gold, if it was possessions, if it was the sun or the moon, any of that would have been sin as well. And he is giving an account. He is saying that he has never done that. And beyond that, verse 29, he carries on, if I've rejoiced at my enemy's misfortune, or gloated over the trouble that came to them, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by invoking a curse against their life. If those of my household have never said, who has not been filled with Job's meat. But no stranger had to spend the night in the street, for my door was always open to the traveler. And so he goes on to say, but he is always looked after. He is always protected in that regard. And that he needs to be careful, because as he contemplates this, he says, even the idea of not confessing my sin, he says. So he doesn't say he's not sinned, but if I have concealed my sin as people do by hiding my guilt in my heart, because I so feared the crowd and so dreaded the contempt of the clans, that I kept silent the word, and would not go outside. Job goes as far as to say, even if I concealed my sin and didn't confess it, didn't speak it out, didn't admit to it, that would be sin. But even that, he seems to say, he's lived an open and an honest life. He's lived an exposed life for all to see. He's not trying to be someone he's not. And so this kind of brings us to a point in Job's argument. You see the different sections and the progression of his thinking as he works through these chapters. And then he gets to this kind of punchline here. In verses 35 to 37. Listen to these words and just consider them, soak them in, and meditate on them for a moment and how profound they are. He says, oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a ruler. And here, there's this twofold aspect. He is saying, I will stand before God and I'll give an account. I will do so proudly because I know the God I serve. I know that I fear him. I know that I am blameless. I know that I'm upright. I know that I shun evil. And he's saying, I will do so. As he says in verse 36, surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a ruler. And so firstly, what Job says here is actually quite frightening. I think most of us today would really struggle to actually be able to stand so confidently as Job does here, saying, I am willing to stand before God and I will give an account of every step of my life. I'm willing to do that. I will do that because I'm that convinced of who I am before God, because I know who God is. And this is what's been really interesting, if you've maybe picked up on it. Job is not saying, I know who I am, but he is saying, I know who I am in light of who God is. That his actions are dictated, are governed by his very fear of the Lord. As we have read early on, and I'll just flip back to read that again for us in the verse 23. It says, for I dreaded destruction from God, and for fear of his splendor I could not do such things. This is the kind of person that Job is. He dreads the destruction that God will bring about on those that oppose him. But more so, he fears God and his splendor. And then the other thing that's so interesting and beautiful that he says here is verse 35. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. And what's so beautiful about this is he's saying, if I had someone to hear me, on one point it feels as though God hasn't been listening to him. He's been speaking, and as he said early on, that he calls out but God doesn't answer. But oh, that someone would hear me now. And if anything, he is even willing to stand before God. But he is now signing his defense. He says, let the Almighty now answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Let God now bring final judgment on me. And let his will be his will. And then you got these last three verses. He says, if my land cries out against me and all its furrows are wet with tears, if I have devoured its yield without payment or broken the spirit of its tenants, then let briars come up instead of wheat and stinkweed instead of barley. He's saying, if I am guilty, let the land be run over. Let my land, everything that I've owned, everything that I've acquired, run over with weeds. Essentially, let it just die up. Let it just go to waste. And so Job looks at at his case, and this is his final thing. He says, if that is the case, then I will face it. Let happen what needs to happen. But he is saying, I am blameless, I am upright, fear God, and I shun evil. We see that through and through and through, time and time again in just these 3 chapters. How Job proclaims that he is blameless. He shows how he's upright, how he looks after people. He expresses how he fears God. And he demonstrates how he also shuns evil. Take those 4 things and work through these 3 chapters again, and you'll see how they just pop out every time he describes something again and again, and how it actually highlights those aspects of what the author and what God has already told us about Job. And it's incredible how this section just ends. It says it in the last part of verse 40, the words of Job are ended. And this ends really this section of what Job has had to say. Job will not speak like this again. He has said his final say, and the next time we hear anything from him, it is when God has spoken. when God has answered him. And so that should excite you as to, well, what is Job's response going to be when God does answer? What is God going to say to Job in light of all of this? Maybe you're still uncertain. Maybe you still don't believe that this is true, that Job can be this man that we have been looking at for the last couple of weeks. But weigh it up, consider it, and then we'll take a look very soon at what God is going to say. But before we come to an end, what is so beautiful about this passage is that we can't be like Job. And Job has done some profound things. And I think that when we're trying to measure up to someone, we're going to fail. And Job, however good he was, he doesn't claim to be sinless. He does claim to have dealt with his sin. So there is a great example of what we should be doing. A life where we are able to confess, to bring our sins before God, and then beyond that, to truly be able to have the confidence that Job has, to be able to say that we will stand before God at the end of this day. But Job has a level of confidence that I think on its own is profound. But for us today, we have a deeper, a greater level of confidence that is incredible. That is wrapped up in verses 35 to 37 of chapter 31. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. And what he says from there is, as I sign now my defense, let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a ruler. And the beauty of this is that, oh, that I had someone to hear me. We have someone that hears us. We don't just have someone that hears us, but we have someone that intercedes for us. Something that Job has already asked for as well. We have Jesus Christ who intercedes for us, who hears us. And that when we are in him and when we receive life, we receive a crown. When we give an account of our every step in Christ, we are affirmed. We are raised up. But there needs to be an exposure, a confession, a repentance, a turning to him, a dependence on him, because he is the only way to the Father. And so for us today, we have a far greater truth, a far greater reality, a far greater reward, which is found in Jesus Christ, who sets us free. Even if we fail and we are like the other characters in what Job says here, in Jesus Christ, we can be free.